All right, folks, we already spoke about the accessory structures of the eye. Now we're going to get into all the other stuff, which are going to be the layers of the eyeball, lens, and the humors, okay? Which are basically these cavities that are filled with fluids. So the first thing I want to do is find a good eye structure that you really connect with. I'm showing you this one here. There's plenty of other visuals that you can get from your textbook that you may feel like, that's a better one because this one has a lot of words on it. But it just depends on which one you want to look at, okay? But it's going to be important for you to grab that because when it comes to the exam and things like that, you're going to be asked about functions of these particular structures. And of course, you might have to label things as well. So first, let's talk about the wall of the eyeball. It's going to contain three layers. We have the fibrous layer, the vascular layer, and the inner sensory layer, sometimes called the retinal layer as well. Okay, so just keep that in mind. We're going to first focus on fibrous, then we'll talk about vascular, then we'll talk about the retinal layer, and then we'll talk about the internal cavities filled with fluids called humors, and of course lenses. Because in order to create these cavities, the lens is going to help separate them into an anterior and posterior segments. So let's go ahead and look into some details. You see all this thickness that's surrounding this here? Yes, that's part of the fibrous layer. Okay. We also have our cornea, which is coming out here. That's also part of the fibrous layer. So it looks like that is going to be our outermost layer that we get to first talk about. And then the vascular layer is going to be the layer that goes in after that. Okay. So our outermost is going to be fibrous, sclera, and also the cornea. Then we're going to get into the choroid. We see that here, and we also can see it here as well. That's going to be the choroid. Then we're going to have the ciliary body, and the ciliary body is going to be over here, right in this whole area here. And then finally, we're going to have our iris, and this is going to be our iris. That's where you're going to get pigments. Depending on how dark brown your eyes are, that means you have more melanin. That's going to be in the iris, versus if you have less melanin, your eyes will be lighter. And then our innermost layer is going to be that retinal layer. Okay, and the retinal layer, as you can see here, well, it's going to be harder to see, but we really have to zoom in. Visual where we get to look at this optic nerve here, and we kind of get to zoom in this area where we're going to be able to see a lot of our photoreceptors, those special sense receptors that we were talking about for the eye. They're going to be in this area here. Okay, so we'll get into those details as we go along. Now, when you're thinking of the lens, here's our lens here. This lens is going to help create two internal cavities. There's going to be an anterior cavity in the front and then a posterior cavity in the back. And this anterior cavity is going to be filled with a particular fluid, okay, and that's going to be the aqueous humor. That means if it's aqueous, it's definitely most likely made of a lot of water. And then we're also going to have the vitreous humor, which is going to be in our posterior segment. Sometimes they also just call these chambers as well, or cavities, so just keep that in mind. And that's going to be, again, a fluid that's made of a lot of water, but also has as more of a gel-like consistency. And we'll talk about details of those as we go along. All right, let's go ahead and focus on the fibrous layer. Now, the fibrous layer is going to be the outermost layer of the eye. So it's going to compose of the sclera, you see here, and also the cornea, which we see here, okay? Now, you know how people always say, oh, the eyes are like the windows to the soul, whoop-de-whoop-whoop-whoop, right? Well, guess what? It's the cornea that can be seen as the clear window that bends light. And it's going to be bending light so that that light can hit all the way back to the sensory layer and then be able to transmit it through the optic nerve to the brain. So the cornea is very, very important. It needs to be transparent so that light can go through. Also, it has a lot of nociceptors or pain receptors because you want to make sure that anything that touches that cornea, you can actually feel. So you want to make sure you can feel it and try to get it out of your eye. And I know we've had styes and things like that where it just feels like a constant pain. But the reason why it feels so constant is because we have those nociceptors. And the goal of those nociceptors from chapter 13 is that they're going to continually give you that signal so that you can get that particular pain out of your way, right? Then we also have the sclera. As you can see, the sclera is thicker. Well, it's not as thicker, but it has a different color. It's very opaque, sometimes even white. And this is going to help, it's kind of like a white outer shell of the eye. That's why when you take an eye, and, well, you're not going to be taking an eye and pulling out somebody's eye. Well, when you're in lab and you see like a cow eye or a sheep eye, wherever you're given, you'll see that it has that white outer shell that's going to protect it and also give shape to the eye. Also the area where we see a lot of those extrinsic muscles attached, right? So if we go back to that, let me just go back to that as well. Remember we talked about our accessory structures are our muscles. You see how we have a lot of attachment of these muscles to the actual sclera? Yes, that's where that attachment is going to be, and the sclera is thick enough for that to happen. Beneath the fibrous layer is going to be the vascular layer, or uvea. Okay, this is going to be our middle pigmented layer of the eye. And again, it's in the middle of the fibrous layer and the retinal layer or sensory layer or inner layer, whatever you want to call that. Okay, it has multiple names at that point. It's going to provide a good blood supply, nutrients, and light control for the eye. And that makes sense, excuse me, because let's look at the choroid here. Here's our choroid here, and then we have it here as well. You can actually see there's blood vessels that's going to be there as well. So this is going to be the posterior portion of the uvea, and again, it's going to supply blood to all layers of the eyeball. So that's how it gets its nourishment. Then we have the ciliary body, and this is going to be that ring of tissue that's going to be surrounding the lens, okay? And the whole goal is to help the lens be able to have shape and for focus for the lens as well. So you can always think of the orbital fat that we saw as well, the extrinsic muscles. If they're going to be given shape to anything, they're also going to be help holding it in position. So keep that in mind. The ciliary body is going to help hold the lens in position, and it's also going to, again, give shape. And what will that do for the lens? Well, it's going to help the lens be able to focus. If the lens is moving around a lot, it won't have a lot of focus once that light goes through that lens portion. And then we're going to have the iris. So let me get another color here. And here's our iris. Well, this portion here and this portion here is the iris. Now, technically, the entire thing is the iris, and within the iris is the pupil, which we're going to get into next. But that's the color portion of the eye. So the color from that iris comes from melanin. Okay, so the more melanin you have, the darker your eyes will be. The less melanin, the lesser, the lighter your eyes will be at that point. And in between our irises, or our iris layer here, is going to be our pupil. And that's the portion of the eye where folks will say, oh my gosh, your pupils are dilated, or your pupils are very tiny and constricted, and we'll talk about that next. Before we do, of course, folks might be saying, well, what does the iris actually do? If the pupil is able to dilate and then constrict, think about it. It basically is telling you that it can adjust the light, the amount of light that's coming to the eye through the pupils. If your eyes are dilated, that means you're probably going to try to get more and more light. You're probably in some dimly lit area, right? But if you're in a very, very bright area, then it doesn't need that much light coming in. Your eyes will probably constrict. Your pupils will probably constrict. So just keep that in mind as well. So let's go ahead and talk about the pupil. This is the central opening in the iris. So as you can see, here is our iris, the pigmented portion, and here's our pupil. We have the iris here, and here's the pupil. Of course, when your pupil is dilated, it's hard to see all the color of the iris. But when it is constricted, then of course you can see more of the actual iris color. And so the size of the pupil is going to change depending on the light levels or the focus, or even, guess what, emotions that you're going through as well. So let's talk about a little bit about pupil regulation. And remember, we're discussing the iris. So here's our iris, okay? Iris has multiple muscles around it. And of course, inside the iris is going to be middle of it is going to be our pupil. Okay, let's keep that in mind. Now, if I wanted to make the actual iris or the pupil dilate, then the muscles here that are around the iris will need to be contracted, right? And these muscles are called the dilator pupillae. And so they're going to contract, as you can see, taking this opening here and making it larger so their pupils dilate. But if I wanted my overall pupils to constrict, then as you can see, this little hole here will get smaller. So the pupils can constrict. You might see some people say, oh, you have beady eyes. All right, that can be one option. As you can see, when they constrict, you have a very small pupil, and that's going to be the sphincter pupillae. So we got the dilator pupillae and the sphincter pupillae. Dilator to dilate the eyes, make the pupil larger. Sphincter to close. And you can think of the sphincter, just a sphincter on your actual stomach, for example, okay? When you have a sphincter, it's like, okay, it's too much food coming in, I'm going to make it smaller and smaller so you don't keep on overeating, for example. That's one option. And guess what, folks? You don't have to just be in a dimly lit room or a bright lit room, for example, for constriction and, again, dilation to happen. It also can happen with your autonomic nervous system. So, again, the autonomic nervous system is made up of the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. So that means that when you have an increase in sympathetic stimulation or dilation of the actual pupil, you could be dealing with stress, danger, or even exercise at that point. You can have an increase in heart rate, increase in blood pressure, and that's going to signify that fight or flight response, right? Versus if you have a parasympathetic stimulation, you might be looking at more constricted pupils. So that means you're probably just relaxing, digestion, you're dealing with digestion, you have a decrease in heart rate, a decrease in blood pressure, for example. And again, you're probably not in any danger or anything at that point. You also might be asleep. So you got to think about those details as well. That is going to be more connected to chapter 14 information. Folks, we made it to the inner sensory layer, also called the retinal layer. And again, this is the innermost layer of the eye. And this is going to be the part that detects light and converts it into that nerve signal so that we can have sight. You can also just say the retina is where light becomes vision. Okay, something if you want to simplify it. And there's two visuals here. You can use either or. I'm just showing you that there's more than one way to see this information. You might find a visual that's better for you to understand it. Do what works for you. Now, the retina is made up of two parts, the neural layer and the pigmented layer. The neural layer is the functional layer that's going to actually respond to light, and the pigmented layer is the outer layer. Okay, so let's look at this. We're going to have our sclera here. We have our choroid that's coming from the vascular layer. And then we're also going to have our pigmented layer of retina here. So here's our pigmented cells right here. See them right there? You see them right here. We have our sclera, which is the outermost. Then we have our choroid. Then we're going to have our pigmented layer, which is going to be the outer layer when it comes to the retina. And then all of this here is going to be our neural layer. Whole area here. Now, what are we looking at? Of course, I'll blow this up in the next slide to make it easier to see. But we are seeing some ganglion cells. You see some ganglion cells. We also have bipolar cells and amacrine cells in here as well. And then we also are going to have our photoreceptors. So remember those special receptors that, remember, it has to go, whatever signal that you're looking at, whatever kind of stimuli that you have, doesn't just go from receptor straight to an afferent pathway. It's going to go to, again, the special receptor cells, and then from their special receptor cells, it kind of gets filtered out to go to whatever it needs to go after that, to an afferent pathway. Okay? So we have some ganglion cells here. We're going to have a bunch of bipolar cells and amacrine cells. It's going to just help with making sure we can move the actual signal to where we need to go. And then we have our rods and cones. And the rods and cones, again, are the photoreceptors that are going to convert the light energy into the electrical signals we need for the brain. You'll also see that this is all connected to the optic nerve here. Why is it connected to the optic nerve? Because we need it to be able to go to the brain. So the neural layer is all the functional layer that's going to respond to light. And the pigmented layer is going to be the outer layer. And what it really does is, if you have light coming through, right, and going all the way to the retina, which is what this layer is, if you have any excess light that is absorbed, you don't want it to all that light to be responding straight to the nervous system. You want some of it to be absorbed to prevent any type of blurred vision that can happen. And that's what that pigmented layer does. All right, so here's a better view. As you can see, we have our rods here and our cones, and these are those photoreceptors, those special receptors for the eye. We also have bipolar cells. We also have amacrine cells, horizontal cells, and the whole goal of these cells is to make sure that we can move the signal where it needs to go. And that means that light signal that's going to be coming, or the electrical signal that's going to be coming from the photoreceptors. And then we also have our ganglion. Our ganglion cells here, and then we're going to have their axons that are going to run through to the optic nerve. And that optic nerve is going to come out through the optic disc, which is also called the blind spot. And we'll talk about those soon. All right. So light's going to hit and go back and hit the actual photoreceptors, the rods and cones. Okay, so that's how light's going to hit. And of course, we have our all other portion of the eye. Say light's coming through our cornea, and it's going to go all the way to the retina, the back of the retina, which is going to be our photoreceptor cells. Okay, don't forget, we also have these pigmented cells here, a pigmented layer, which is going to help absorb anything that's stray light. And so once it actually hits the photoreceptor cells, they're going to take that signal and they're going to transform it into an electrical signal. That electrical signal is then going to go back towards the ganglion cells. So it's going to have to go through the bipolar cells and the horizontal cells and amacrine cells so it can get to the ganglion cells. And again, what the ganglion cell is going to do, it's going to allow the electrical signal now to travel down its axon. Boom, 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 boom. And we're going to have all of our ganglion cell axons that are going to run along the inner surface of the retina, and they're going to leave the eye as an optic nerve. So let's go back and look at that really quick. So again, we have all of our ganglion axons here, and then we're forming our optic nerve. And this optic nerve is going to be coming out of our blind spot. It's also called the optic disc. You can see that here, the optic disc. Okay, so that's just a region where there are no photoreceptors. So it can't detect light or anything like that. It's just there to, of course, allow our optic nerve to exit so it can actually, our signal can reach the brain. See other structures like our macula lutea here, for example, which is just this really small area that is responsible for creating sharp vision. So just keep that. That is all of our layers. Now we need to get into the humors and the lens. So let's get into that next. Okay, so we've seen the lens before. We haven't talked about it 100%, but we've seen where it was, like as far as in our original visuals, okay? And we said that the lens is going to allow, the lens and everything that's around is going to allow us to create multiple cavities in the eye. The first is the anterior cavity, and then we're going to have the posterior cavity. Sometimes you'll see them being called chambers as well, but we usually say cavities in general. Now, the anterior cavity or chamber, okay, is going to be made of aqueous humor, and the posterior cavity is going to be vitreous humor. Okay? Now, the lens itself and all the ligaments that's going to help cause this division is going to create these segments, or again, these cavities or these chambers, to allow the eye to get a lot of nourishment from different fluids, and also to help the light be focused better. And one more important thing is to maintain pressure of the eye. You might notice that when you go get an eye exam, they always kind of have one little thing that takes a puff of air towards your eye. That's going to help figure out the actual pressure of the eye. They're really testing if your aqueous humor fluid is actually working properly for your eye. And why would they test that? Because they want to make sure that you don't have things like glaucoma. And glaucoma is going to happen when that aqueous humor can't drain properly, and that means you're going to have an increase in pressure of the eye, and guess what? That can lead to vision loss. So that anterior chamber that includes that aqueous humor is going to be very important. What is aqueous humor? It's basically clear water-like liquid. What does it have in it? Electrolytes, going to have glucose, and sometimes protein. What's the whole purpose of it? To nourish all the avascular cornea that we see here, and to nourish the lens. What we mean by nourish, we want to make sure it's lubricated well. We want to make sure it has all the electrolytes and everything to keep it going. And one important thing is that it's going to carry away waste. We already talked about how it's going to maintain the intraocular pressure, but it also keeps the optical surface smooth. And remember, we already said there's a lot of pain receptors in this area, so that if anything is touching this and it's like you start feeling any excess waste, you automatically can like notice it and try to fix what's going on with your eye. Then we have the posterior cavity. Again, posterior segment, posterior, well, mainly it's just going to be the cavity or a segment here. This is going to be made of vitreous humor, which is basically 99% water, got some collagen in there, and some hyaluron, which is giving it its gel-like consistency. This, again, is going to support and press the retina against the choroid. So if we want light to come through here, we want light to hit the retina, or that sensory layer, that inner sensory layer. And this is going to help compress that so that, of course, the light is traveling better there. As you can see, it's going to maintain that globular shape that we noticed from the eyes themselves. And again, we want that clear optical path for that light to hit that retina. And remember, we talked about the retinal layer. We're also talking about, again, hitting those photoreceptors, meaning the rods and the cones. Now let's talk about the lens itself. We got our lens, we got our iris, which you already know have our smooth muscle. We have our pupil here, we have our cornea here, we have our aqueous chamber, which is going to have our aqueous humor there, all those details. Okay? Now, what is the lens? The lens is literally a transparent, flexible structure that's going to focus focus light onto the retina. So again, we have our sensory areas here for our retina. Of course, this is going to be our optical nerve coming out of our optical disc or blind spot. So we need to make sure we're actually focusing the light on the retina that comes through. So the light's going to come through that cornea. And again, the cornea is going to help with that positioning of everything. And we also see little ligaments that are attached to the lens. It's going to help with that positioning to sharpen that focus of the light coming through. It's going to help and go through the vitreous humor, which again is helping keep that retinal layer in place so that the light's going to hit it and again have a clear optic pathway. And as you can see, if I erase this piece here, the lens has this kind of biconvex structure. It looks like this. Some version of that. And again, it's very, very flexible and elastic. It's also avascular. And again, the whole goal is to focus light onto the retina. And that means you got to deal with certain cells of the lens. These are basically going to be a lot of fibers packed with these crystalline proteins to help with that focus. Now, over time, if you're talking about something that is all about flexibility and elasticity, over time, you can decrease elasticity and decrease flexibility with age. And the more dense the lens become, the more convex, that means your shape is going to change, and the less elastic where you're going to have. Mainly near vision issues. So you see, if you can't see up close a lot, you're like nearsighted, for example, that can also be due to age changes. You also have a situation of cataracts. Now here's a version of cataract here. As you can see, the lens becomes very, very cloudy. What is that going to give you? Blurred vision. You're going to see very, very dimly. Some folks just don't really see much at all. They just see shapes of things. And this can happen from aging. This can happen from diabetes. And specifically from diabetes, you have a lot of sugar running through your blood, and there's a lot of small capillaries in the eye. So a lot of times you have sugar just kind of scratching those capillaries as well. That can cause clouding of the lens. Smoking, being in a bright light all the time can also cause cataracts as well. But the cool thing about cataracts is that they can be surgically corrected. It's a pretty well-known procedure, so a lot of folks do that when they need to make sure that they can get their vision back properly. All right, speaking of vision and visuals, right, we can kind of have an overall idea of what a visual pathway is just by the information that we know. So we know light's going to come through the eye, the left and the right eye. It's going to hit the retina, which is made of photoreceptors, rods, and cones, and then that light signal is going to be converted to an electrical signal once we hit those ganglion cells, and the electrical signal is going to be processed down the axon of those ganglion cells, right, into the optic nerve. And so as you can see, for the left and the right eye, we do have different fibers that are color-coded. So we have a red fiber here on the left and a blue fiber here on the right that are both going to be lateral. But then medially, we have a red fiber on the right and a blue fiber on the left that are medial. And so what's going to happen is that signal is going to go down the optic nerve, but it's going to reach an optic chiasm, which means that the medial fibers here, as you can see on the left and right, are going to cross. And this is going to ensure that each brain hemisphere can see opposite visual fields. Okay, so once they are going to cross, then we're going to have our fibers go down an optic tract and continue on until we get to the thalamus. And then from the thalamus, then we'll be able to have that signal reach the occipital lobe or the visual cortex, where we're going to have the images processed and, of course, understand perception. Okay, so if you think about it in general, you can say the light's going to hit the retina is going to have the signal go to the optic nerve. The optic nerve is going to have some of the medial fibers cross at the optic chiasm. That's going to ensure, again, the brain hemispheres are on the opposite visual field. Then that signal is going to go to the thalamus, and then from the thalamus is going to go to the occipital cortex, so an image can be perceived and you can see what you're looking at, right? We also have the superior colliculus here, and this superior colliculus is a part of the actual midbrain, and some fibers can go in this area as well. That's if you want to control visual reflexes, like if your eye and your head moving, or your eye or your head is moving towards a certain stimuli, then you definitely can have that control there. So that'll pretty much be it for the overall eye. Again, we have our accessory structures. We went through our 3 layers. We also went through the lens and the humors, and also we kind of wrapped it up with this visual pathway. So I'll see you in the next video where we get to go over the ear.